Okay, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. on the October 30th, the Wednesday. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo online morning seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce the latest World Bank report presented by the authors of those reports. Every year, every spring and fall, each of the chief economists for the regional vice president offices put together the economic update of respective regions with depth analysis on the latest key topics of the respective regions. This week, we are going to feature the South Asia version of it, South Asia Development Update, October 2024 edition. This is titled Women, Jobs, and the Growth. This was released on October 10th. We have three distinguished speakers from the Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia: Franziska Onezorge, the Chief Economist, the Zoe Liu-Xie, the Senior Economist, and the Jonah Lexter, who is the Economist, all of them from the Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia regions. So next 30, 40 minutes, we are going to listen to their presentation summarizing the key messages, findings of the report. Following their presentations, I'll read the questions that we received from the audience. If you did not have opportunities in advance to send your questions, please do so by sending your question using the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar. Or you can simply send your question to me by email, or you can post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question on your behalf, asking the speakers to respond. So with that, I would like to invite Franziska to come in to kick off the presentation. Franziska, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I understand that you're going to see our update. You have already seen the East Asia update, and you will see the other regional updates. So spoiler alert, this is the fastest growing region of all of them. It's growing faster than all the others, but it's not growing fast enough to meet the region's own goals of reaching higher income status. That is why we looked at the sources of untapped growth potential. And there are two sources in particular we looked at: women and openness to trade and investment. You will see, my colleague Jonah will show you that only a third of women work in South Asia. It's much less than about half in other emerging markets, and much less than the 3/4 of men. We estimate that if the share of women working would be raised to the share of men working, GDP in South Asia could be up to 1/2 higher. That is one source of untapped potential. It's not easy to unlock that because there's so many forces preventing women from working, and we will go through them. The other source of untapped potential is openness to trade and investment. Each and every one of our countries, with one exception, is among the most closed quarter of emerging markets and developing economies in the world to trade, FDI, global bank lending, portfolio investment. The only thing they're open in is remittances. And this is in part, it's just sheer luck that they're not on the big shipping lanes, but there's also a very deliberate policy, and Zoe will show you that. The policies are deliberately restrictive. They're among the highest tariffs and the most restrictive FDI regimes. That is then, of course, discouraging trade, which is a pity. Because if the region could bring itself to open up to trade and investment, it would actually be very well placed to thrive in the current environment of geoeconomic fragmentation. Because they're not just politically non-aligned, they're also economically non-aligned. And that would have the nice side benefit that greater export openness, greater exports would have the collateral benefit of also employing more women. So with this, I hand over to my colleagues Zoe Xie and Jonah Lexter.
Thank you, Koichi. Very glad to be here again to share with everyone what we find in the latest South Asia Development Update. So let me start with the slides. So as Francisca has previewed, between Jonah and myself, we'll go through the outlook, the risks, and two of the untapped potential that we focus in this update. Let me start right away with the forecast. As Francisca also previewed, perhaps not surprisingly, South Asia is again the fastest growing EMD region in the world. So even 6 months ago in our last update, we had already expected South Asia to be a bright spot in the global economy. And in fact, South Asia's prospects, as we find out this time, are even brighter than we had expected 6 months ago. As you can see in the chart on the left, almost across the board, we are upgrading forecast in across the board in 5 countries, 5 out of the 7 countries in South Asia that have forecast for this year and the next. That's shown in the blue bar. And overall, we are actually expecting South Asia to grow by 6.4% in 2024 and 6.2% per year over the next 2 years. So for 2024 alone, that's a 0.4 percentage point upgrade compared to our forecast for the year 6 months ago. So broadly speaking, what are the reasons driving these upgrades? There are a few. For example, better than expected private consumption in India, faster than expected investment growth in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. And also on the export side, there were faster than expected recovery in tourism sector, benefiting the tourism reliant countries such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan, and also hydropower exports better than expected, benefiting Bhutan and Nepal. So those reasons are really driving South Asia to becoming, once again, the fastest growing EMD region. Let's dig a bit deeper into individual countries. As I said, and as I was showing just now, 5 out of the 7 countries that have forecast this time, we are upgrading the forecasts. So in India, again, that's because of faster private consumption growth. In Pakistan, as the economy benefits from availability of imported inputs, easing domestic supply chains, and lower expected inflation. And in Sri Lanka, because of faster than expected investment, Nepal, tourism, hydro construction, and Bhutan, again, hydro construction and tourism. So there are 2 outliers. It's quite obvious, I guess, in Maldives and also in Bangladesh. Those are highlighted with red boxes. So in Bangladesh, the forecasts were downgraded because of mainly 2 reasons. One is the social unrest going on during the summer and the political uncertainty afterward. Those factors weighed on investor and consumer confidence. And the second reason is that in recent times, there were floods that are expected to moderate agricultural growth. So those 2 factors are expected to pull down growth forecast over during the current and actually the fiscal year that just passed in June. For Maldives, there is a shift outward in growth forecast, mainly because the completion of the Belena International Airport is again being delayed. That's in part because of the country's shortage in foreign exchange reserves. At the time of the publication of the report, the Maldives had about 1.5 months of import in terms of available reserves. That seems to have been causing a slowdown in construction imports, which have contributed to the delay in completion of the big airport. As a result, we're downgrading Maldives growth for 2025, but actually the forecast for 2026 growth has been upgraded. So again, that's a shift outward in growth prospects for Maldives. So given that the region is, the growth is robust, Of course, as usual, these baseline forecasts have already priced in all the good things that could happen and also a few bad things. But on balance, the risks for the region are again tilted towards the downside. So in the report, we discussed quite a few of these downside risks. Today, I'll show you 2 or 3 of those. And if you're interested, please go to our report. There are more interesting stories there. So the first risk I would like to discuss today is again on climate risk. As we have flagged in almost every South Asia development update in the past, South Asia faces major climate risks. In this region, our colleagues actually show that the most vulnerable in South Asia are the most exposed to these climate risks, especially the extreme temperature risks. In other words, as you can see in the first chart, the leftmost chart, the poorest households live in the hottest areas. So the left chart actually shows that household wealth is significantly above the mean, above average, when the mean temperature is 29 degrees Celsius, and it's significantly below average when it's 34 degrees Celsius. And that's the case for both urban and rural, and more so for urban than for rural. That's actually also in line with the empirical evidence that our colleagues documented for other countries that we show in the last edition of the South Asia Development Update. The exposure of poor households, as I say, is more severe in urban areas. And so that the first chart is showing you for extreme temperature. The middle chart is showing a similar case, which is flooding. Flooding is also a major risk of climate risk for South Asia. But here, the findings are not that straightforward because not all flooded areas have systematically poorer households. At least in rural areas, some of the richer households also live in flooded areas. But in urban areas, as you can see, the frequently flooded areas, they tend to have more poorer households. So in the past edition of the report, we recommended that households should be helped to adapt to climate change by moving into non-agricultural jobs. But it turns out, as we show for a sample of India firms shown in the right chart, that the firm sizes also tend to be smaller in areas where the temperature is hotter. So what that says is that in these areas, it's even harder for firms to create these non-agricultural jobs to accommodate the transition of workers from agriculture to non-agriculture jobs. Moving on to the next risk, which is social unrest. I think a lot of you must be aware of what's happened during the summer in Bangladesh. So that is quite a reminder for South Asia that the possibility of social unrest, which could really derail growth. Over the past decade, South Asia actually has had much faster per capita income growth than the average EMD outside of South Asia. That's shown by the blue line in the first chart. What the red line is showing is that in contrast to the faster than average growth in GDP per capita, life satisfaction actually has fallen quite behind other EMDs. So perhaps that is one reason why the people in South Asia are quite restive and staging protests. That's shown in the right chart, in the second chart. If we tabulate all the large protest events since 2022 by EMD regions, South Asia has had the second most large protest events, second only after the Europe and Central Asia region. That's again a very stern reminder of what could happen if social unrest could unravel. So given that all those risks, these risks are actually particularly challenging for South Asia, especially for South Asia's government. Why? Because South Asia's government have very little room to absorb these risks. As you can see in the first chart, about 30% of South Asian governments' revenues already go to paying off debt, much more than in other EMDs. This is especially the case for Maldives and Sri Lanka, and if their debt deferments don't come through, things could be much worse for them. And even if the governments could afford to spend a lot more, they may not want to, because in South Asia, as you can see in the second chart, the commercial banks already hold a large proportion of their assets in government debt. And if governments spend even more and have to be financed by more debt, the banking sector have to absorb even more government assets, and thus could crowd out even more private investment, which will be worse for the country's economy overall. So at the same time, all the governments in the region are already planning reforms, whether it's to boost growth or in some way to improve the fiscal position. For example, in India, the government is implementing a whole host of measures to boost employment and upscaling, including productivity, resilience in agriculture, and promoting investment in services. So Sri Lanka's government, for example, has announced reforms on state-owned banks and plans to further reform tax and trade and investment. So our forecasts on the outlook are based on the assumption that these reforms are carried through or proceed as planned. So if there are any thing that prevent these reforms from going through, the growth outlook could actually be worse. So that's also a vulnerability for the growth outlook for the region. So let me move on to the first untapped potential, which is openness to global trade and investment. As Francisca already mentioned, the region actually, if we look at the statistics, the region looks quite bad in terms of openness to trade and investment. But it might have surprised you if I show you these charts, because you may think of many examples that remind you of how South Asia is open to trade and investment. I could think of, for example, I'm wearing clothes from Bangladesh, or I'm drinking teas from Sri Lanka. I receive emails or phone calls from Chennai's call centers. These are actually quite isolated pockets of openness. And as I'm showing you in the chart, for example, in terms of trade, if we compare each South Asian country to their comparator countries, most of them are in the bottom quartile, whether it's regular EMDs, which is shown in so the pink box in the first chart shows the interquartile of EMD countries. All of the larger South Asian countries are in the bottom quartile in terms of trade as percent of GDP. And for the two smaller countries in the region, only Maldives is above in the quartile range. And if we look at net FDI inflow, all South Asian countries, all the bigger South Asian countries, except for India, are in the bottom quartile. And for the smaller countries, they're doing better, but not that much better. Actually, the only aspect where South Asia is remarkably open is in remittances, and that's shown in the right chart. As you can see, Nepal actually is among the top quartile of EMDs with the highest remittance inflow as percent of GDP. And all the other countries are actually not far behind. So almost all of them are in the interquartile range. So that, as we show in the another separate analysis in the report, could be a potential vulnerability, especially for the region's competitiveness because of remittances' effect on real exchange rate. So what has led to this relative closeness to global trade and investment? So these two charts are showing you that they are quite policy driven. So the left chart is showing that actually this lack of openness is not a coincidence. It's really deliberately a policy choice. For Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Maldives, their average tariffs are actually in the top quartile among EMDs. And even if we don't look at the tariffs themselves, a lot of countries have high or very restrictive non-tariff measures. For example, Pakistan scores in the bottom quartile EMDs on custom procedures, such as timeliness of logistics, tracking, and tracing. Those are the additional barriers to trade that countries that reflect countries' policy choices. So that's trade. And then on the right side, we're showing you a measure of FDI restrictiveness. But unfortunately, among South Asian countries, only India has this measure. But still, we can compare. So this is a measure coming from OECD, but we can compare India to the other EMD countries. And as you can see that India really has more FDI restrictions than the majority of the 50 largest EMDs that are covered in the database. And so these are, as I said, really policy choices that the region has made. So what if South Asia could become more open to trade? What could be the gain, or is it worth doing it? So in a box or analysis in the report, my colleagues actually shown that indeed the region has some advantage if it wants to open to trade. One potential advantage is that the region's countries have deliberately positioned themselves to be politically non-aligned. What does it mean? If you, on the left side, the first chart was showing you that by very commonly used measure, which is the UN voting pattern, if we rank countries or the UN members from the leftmost, which represents Syria, to the rightmost, which represents USA, most of the EMDs actually are non-aligned, but they are closer to China than to the United States. And then in the middle chart, we show that for each of the South Asian countries, they're also relatively non-aligned. They're actually in that very similar to the most EMDs, as shown in the gray box. That's interquartile range for the EMDs. So almost all the South Asian countries are within that box. What it means is that South Asian countries have been deliberately politically non-aligned, but it may not be enough to just be politically non-aligned, because all the other EMDs countries are pretty much similar. What the region really needs to do is to become more open to trade and global trade and investment. But the region actually does have one advantage, which is that its export partners and FDI sources are very much diverse across the geopolitical spectrum. That's what's shown in the right chart, the last one. So here you see a new measure of geopolitical diversity of export markets and FDI sources. And the red range is for South Asia, and the whiskers are for the EMD interquartile range. And almost all South Asian countries actually export an above average share of exports and receive an above average share of FDI from non-China EMDs, especially the Gulf countries. So this shows that the region are actually quite diverse in this aspect, and that could that the region could benefit from opening up to trade, especially now the world is going through a wave of geo-economic fragmentation. The region could open up and take advantage of the fragmentation and really position themselves to be connected countries. That's one of the region's untapped potential. Now I'll pass the torch on to Jonah to talk more about the women as the other untapped potential of the region.
Zoe, can you go to the next slide? Next slide. Yes. Okay. Thanks. So let's start by just establishing a few kind of basic facts about women's labor force participation in South Asia. So on the left-hand side, the chart shows that female labor force participation is in the bottom quartile of other emerging markets and developing economies in every single South Asian country except for Bhutan, which tends to be kind of a positive outlier on this metric. This is from the most recent 2023 ILO internationally comparable data. What it tells us is that the range across South Asia is between 20 and 40% of the working age population, much lower than the emerging market average of about 55%. Now, there's a lot of debate within these countries about kind of the measurement of female labor force participation, but even when we use local statistics, which tend to have their own kind of definitions and measurement choices, we still find that most of these South Asian countries tend to fall in the bottom quartile of emerging markets. So South Asian countries are low relative to other emerging markets. They're also low relative to male labor force participation rates. What we find also in the report is that in the region, male labor force participation rates are about 77% in 2023, while female participation rates are only 32%. So there's this big, 40+ point gap. And what's remarkable is this gap has been quite, stagnant over time. Really, the situation hasn't improved dramatically in any South Asian country. And so that's what you can see on the right-hand side, where we're plotting the change between 2010 and 2023 in female labor force participation over time, right? It's really kind of the stagnant and low rate of female labor force participation. Although in the past 13 years, there has been some movement, right? You can see that there's been increases in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, for example. There's been decreases in Sri Lanka. That's the only country in which the rate has actually fallen since 2010. And also what we find is when we compare South Asian countries to countries at similar levels of income, again, this low female labor force participation comes out. South Asian countries have labor force participation rates of women about 5 to 25 percentage points lower than what would be predicted just by their GDP per capita. Again, with the exception of Bhutan, which tends to be the positive outlier in this story. Next slide. Now, does this matter in economic terms, right? What are the economic costs of low female labor force participation? Well, we estimate from a variety of different methods that boosting female labor force participation rate from that 32% to the level of men, that's 77%. So that's a 40+ percentage point increase, would lead to an increase in regional GDP of about 13 to 51%. So, how did we estimate this range? Well, on the left chart, you can see this range of estimated effects. That's the blue bar there, using 8 different variants of kind of standard modeling approaches that basically fall into 2 categories. One is what we'd call a production function approach. The other is what we'd call a structural or occupational choice model. And essentially what these models are trying to do is using a production function, see what happens to output when you increase labor by the amount that it would take to close the gap between men and women. And so that 13 to 51 percentage point range, it depends on a lot of assumptions that you make in the model. And there are really 2 dimensions, I think, that are most important. The first thing that we find is that highest results, that 51% gain, are obtained when this increase in female labor supply is accompanied by capital accumulation, right? If there are no kind of new machines or tools for women to use when they enter the labor market, of course, you're going to get kind of less bang for your buck. But if capital markets are efficient and we see a kind of commensurate increase in capital accumulation, well, then we see much higher effects on GDP. The second key dimension that matters in these models is that women can enter jobs that are as productive as the jobs that are held by men. One thing that we show in the report is that women tend to work in less productive jobs than men ex ante, right? And so if they're going to enter the same jobs that they currently hold, or the same kind of structural composition, then we're going to see a much smaller effect. But of course, if they can enter higher paying, higher wage, formal sector occupations, then we're going to see a much bigger effect on GDP. So the flexibility of capital and the flexibility of the labor market are really the 2 key dimensions on which this turns. And if you have both of those things, you get closer to that 51% increase. Then on the right-hand side chart, we're just kind of ranking the countries based on these projected increases in GDP. And as you can probably guess, the countries with the largest initial gaps see the largest GDP gain. So that's Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Those tend to have the largest gaps between male and female participation. But also we use this chart to highlight the importance of capital. So the red models are the range of estimates where capital is static, where it doesn't adjust, and the blue model. The blue bars correspond to the range of estimates where capital is allowed to adjust. We could think of these as kind of long-run estimates. And you can see there's a big gap for most countries in those two ranges, illustrating the kind of critical role of financial markets in facilitating this transition. And so next, what we're going to do is try to kind of ask why, if female labor force participation remains low. And first, what we do in the report is we investigate the role of structural change, and in particular, 3 structural changes that occur in the process of development that might be pulling women into the labor market. This is mostly kind of on the labor demand side. We look at urbanization, the shift to services, and opening up to international trade. So let me talk about urbanization for a second. We argue that the literature tells us urban areas may have kind of better opportunities for women, particularly educated women. They have weaker gender norms, right? They have more competition between firms. They tend to have higher relative wages for women and higher returns to education. So what we argue is that the shift towards urbanization should pull women into the labor market. Now, do we observe this internationally and specifically in South Asia? So to answer that question, what we're going to do, we're going to estimate the relationship between urban population growth and female labor force participation across the world, as well as in South Asia. And that's what we have on the right-hand side. Those 2 blue bars give us the relationship, that correlation between urbanization and female labor force participation in the entire world and in the sample of just emerging markets. And what emerges is a clear kind of positive relationship between these 2 variables, very consistent with the empirical literature in economics. Now, when we look at South Asia, things are kind of different, right? That's the red bar there. We actually find a negative and non-significant relationship among South Asian countries. And so why is this? Well, it's actually because urbanization doesn't seem to be pulling women into the labor market, and participation rates are actually lower for urban than rural women in South Asia. And that's what we have on the left-hand chart, right? The first blue bar there, the unconditional, basically just shows you the age and education adjusted difference between female labor force participation in urban and rural areas. So it's about 16 percentage points lower in urban areas. And that is somewhat of an anomaly kind of in global experience, right? Now, it could be that part of this is driven by what's called an income effect. As urban areas tend to be richer and as incomes rise, it's kind of well established that women tend to exit the labor force. So when we control for wages in that same model, that's the second blue bar on the left, we find that it only reduces this urban-rural gap by a few percentage points, right? So still there's this 10 to 11 percentage point difference in participation rates between urban and rural women. And so it seems like urbanization is not kind of producing that boost in female labor force participation that would be expected based on global experience. Now, what about services, right? We know, again, from the literature that women tend to have a comparative advantage in service-based occupations that kind of emphasize soft skills and brain over kind of physical strength, brawn, so to speak, in agriculture or manufacturing. And the rise in services employment tends to increase the demand for female labor, right? That's the story of the post-World War II development path of the US and Western Europe. Now, across other emerging markets, we tend to find that services subsectors are disproportionately female dominated. So that's the graph on the left-hand side. The yellow diamonds show the average female share of employment in a bunch of different economic subsectors. And when you look at the services sectors, retail sector, hospitality sector, the education sector, you find relatively large 50, 60, 70% female employment shares. Now, what's interesting is comparing those yellow diamonds to the blue bars, right? Because that's the female employment share for South Asia. And what we find there is that in several key services subsectors that employ 50 or 60% women in other emerging markets, there's basically no women in these sectors in South Asia. So if you look at the retail sector, the hospitality sector, that includes tourism, there's less than 20% female representation in those sectors, whereas in other emerging markets, it's more like 50 or 60%. Now, what this suggests, again, is that South Asia is kind of departing from the global story or narrative in the effect of services. And to test for that, what we do is, again, the same analysis that we did for urbanization. Across countries in kind of global sample, we estimate that correlation between the share of services employment and female labor force participation, both in the world and just in other emerging markets. And those are the two blue bars on the right. And what we find, again, is that at least when you consider the whole global sample, there is this positive relationship. And that relationship seems to be driven perhaps mostly by advanced economies, because that relationship becomes somewhat weaker when you just look at emerging markets. However, in South Asia, when we look at local labor markets across South Asia, we find a negative correlation. So that's that red bar on the right-hand side. An increase in services employment actually is associated with a reduction in female labor force participation. And what's driving that is that, that's the agriculture sector kind of shifts towards services. Women are exiting agriculture, but they're not being absorbed into non-agricultural employment, particularly in the services sector, as has been the case in other in kind of global experience. So again, something is constraining women in South Asia from taking advantage of the opportunities that are opened up by increasing services. Now, the last source of structural change that we examine is trade, right? And Zoe already spoke to you a little bit about how the region is one of the most closed to trade in the world, and that actually matters quite a bit for female labor force participation. Because again, when we survey the global evidence, we find that exporting firms tend to be more gender equal for several reasons. One is because they face kind of international competition, so they can't really afford to discriminate. They also tend to adopt better technology, which evidence shows can be complementary with women's skills. So trade can create opportunities for women. At the same time, import competition, of course, can have negative effects on labor markets, and those might be kind of disproportionately large for women. So trade might be this kind of double-edged sword, right? And so we investigate these questions in South Asia first by looking at the share of women in tradable sectors, and that's on the left-hand side. What we find is that in the most heavily traded sectors, women actually do form a larger share of employment, right? Between 30 and 50% in the top exporting sectors, compared to about 15% of women in non-tradable sectors. And so this kind of confirms, the anecdotal stories you hear about Bangladeshi garment factories that are all women, or BPOs in India that are primarily women. So it does seem to be the case that those kind of isolated tradable sectors are good for women. And so then we look at the kind of aggregate effects of trade on female labor force participation in South Asia by looking at local labor markets that have more or less kind of exposure to import and export shocks. And that's the analysis on the right-hand side. We correlate these local exposure to import and export shocks with local female labor force participation rates. And what we find is that there's a significant positive association between export shocks and female labor force participation, as expected, because these export sectors tend to employ more women. But the sign of this effect flips completely when we look at import shocks. So it does seem like those kind of displacing import shocks that destroy local jobs disproportionately affect women, perhaps because they're already kind of more tenuously attached to labor markets. And so I think what this suggests is that there is this untapped potential in trade. The region is very closed. It could open up substantially and reap the benefits, not just kind of in aggregate, but also in terms of gender equality. However, at the same time, we've got to be careful about kind of import competition. And if firms are not competitive enough, ultimately there may be some kind of negative effects on female labor force participation. So, I've kind of explained to you that there's these large positive effects of increasing female labor force participation, but there seem to be some kind of barriers standing in the way because the standard demand side kind of trends and structural changes don't seem to be pulling women into the labor force, right? And if it was such an obvious thing for women to work, why aren't they working in South Asia? And so in our chapter, we look at several different dimensions of this kind of interlocking, relatively complicated problem. We look at the labor demand side, we look at the labor supply side, we look at the legal framework, and we look at social norms, right? And on the demand side, right, I've already kind of given you a little bit of this, but remember that the region is very close to trade, and women lose out from that because the export sectors tend to be associated with more female labor force participation. At the same time, we still know that sectors that should be employing more women, like services, are not. So there must be other restrictions that matter as well. So one of those potential restrictions is on the legal side, and that's what we plot in the left-hand chart here. According to the latest data from Women, Business, and the Law, which is a World Bank initiative to measure the gender equality of the legal framework across countries, three of our countries, three of the big ones in particular, rank in the bottom quartile of legal rights for women, right? Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Now, India tends to do relatively well on legal rights, but ultimately it's not just about legal rights; it's also about implementation, right? And WBL also measures the kind of strength of implementation of gender equality laws, and we also find that several of the South Asian countries tend to rank in the bottom quartile on implementation as well. These laws are relatively conservative, and their enforcement is kind of uneven, in part because of conservative social norms. And that's what we show in the middle figure here. We're plotting the share of people in each of these countries that agrees with what's called the female homemaker norm, or this idea that essentially women should be primarily homemakers, right? And so all of the countries in our sample in South Asia, except for Bhutan, the outlier, are in the bottom quartile of emerging markets in terms of the conservativeness of their social norms, right? And so in the chapter, we showed that these social norms and gender equality legislation are significant and important predictors of female labor force participation. And that's the chart that we show on the right-hand side. These blue bars give us the impact on female labor force participation of going from the bottom quartile of legal equality or conservative social norms to the top quartile. And so what these estimates imply is about an 8 percentage point increase in female labor force participation if you go from the bottom to the top quartile of legal equality, and about a 3 to 4 percentage point increase if you go from the most conservative to the least conservative quartile of social norms. So ultimately, these social norms and laws matter in restraining a female labor force participation, which of course there's an economic cost to that. Now, the policy implications here, I think, can be somewhat pessimistic, as this is a complex problem with many causes, and individual interventions on the supply side, like safe transport or childcare access, won't necessarily unlock all of the constraints at once. At the same time, I think it's also quite clear that structural change and development alone won't kind of solve this problem either, because we've seen decades of structural change and growth in the region, and as we can see, the kind of labor force participation rate of women has been stagnant. So of course you can read the chapter for more detail on our policy framework, but we call for a multi-pronged package that's going to address the demand side, supply side constraints, the legal framework, as well as the conservative social norms. And I think that's all we have. So we can take questions now. And thanks again.
Can I just wrap up just to summarize what we said?
Yes, of course.
So basically, the region is the fastest growing of all the EMD regions, but there are serious downside risks. Opening to the region is quite close to trade, which is a missed opportunity because it's actually quite well placed in the breadth of its trading partners and its geopolitical non-alignment to really trade with the world and get the productivity gains that come from it, and also in the process be able to employ this vast reservoir of women that are currently not in the labor market. It's pretty straightforward. Policies to open up to trade are pretty straightforward. It's much more difficult to, as Jonah already mentioned, to find policies that can really bring millions of women into the labor market. That needs a lot of things to go right at the same time. So happy to take questions, Koichi.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of the South Asia Development Update. So, we received some question. Excuse me. We received some question in advance, but also some question came in during the presentation. These are like a three bucket of the questions. One is about India. The other one is about the smaller countries, and then the other is about women issues. So let me read those questions all together and ask you, Francisca, to orchestrate the team to make a comment on respective points. So first one on India-related questions. Would you please elaborate on the prospects of the poverty reduction in India? India poverty reduction seems to be the fundamental key to push the poverty reduction effort globally and achieve the sustainable development goals. So this was first part of the India-related questions. But during the presentation, we received the question from Yamashita-san. Thank you for your question. I remember the early 1990s, India was very closed, and the World Bank worked to liberalize its trade and regulatory regimes. It looks like it is still very closed. What is the progress of the liberalization measures, i.e. Washington Consensus, over the last 30 years? Are they wasted? So this was a question from Yamashita-san. Thank you. First part of the question from Sasaki-san. Okay, and then next the bucket of the question is the smaller countries. So let me read. What are the challenges for smaller countries in the region, i.e. Maldives and Bhutan, to achieve faster growth? And what should these governments do? Does regional integration in the region help them? So these are the smaller country questions. And then third one, the 3 points from our viewers on the women-related questions. Let me read. Does digital technology play some roles in help expand job opportunities for women in South Asia? And if so, what should the government in the region do in this regard? So technology and women question. And then I received a question from Honma-san during the presentation. How would you assess the impact of potentially jobless growth in South Asia region? Your data appears to indicate that the stagnation of female labor force participation may be triggered at least partly by the lack of decent jobs for educated women in domestic labor market, not necessarily only by gender norms or legal gender inequality. So these are the questions that we received. India question, smaller country question, and the women-related questions. I would like to ask Francisca to come in to orchestrate the team to make a comment on the respective point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you for these questions. These are all good questions. So I leave the Maldives and Bhutan and the regional integration question to Zoe and the women question to Jonah. You know, jobless growth is a really important question that we have just published a paper on. So I will let Zoe go first on this one. Now, in India, poverty reduction. What India has achieved over the last, well, over this millennium is really quite extraordinary. It has reduced global poverty. It accounts for about 1/3 of the reduction in global poverty. It's been a decline from 43% to 10%. It's been a remarkable decline in poverty. And we can assume that this will continue as long as growth continues at this steady pace. Because that's another feature of India, that it has not had many crises like other countries had. Other emerging markets tend to have lots of stop and goes, recessions. India has just chugged along at a 6, 7, 8% growth for for decades, essentially. And that really helps with poverty reduction. So our expectation is that growth will continue so in well above 5%, so 6-ish, 7-ish% over the next few years, and that will continue to reduce poverty. On the closedness, you're right. I mean, yes, before the 91 crisis and that opening and the elimination of the license Raj, India was very, very closed. I believe the average tariff was around 40% or something like that. And it has come down dramatically. But here we compare, the whole world has become more open since then. All the emerging markets, the advanced economies, everyone's become more open. It's just that the region has lagged. The region has lagged, and the mindset is also very different from the mindset of East Asia that you probably witnessed. And you probably also heard about from Aditya's team in your previous session on East Asia update. There is less of this keenness to compete in export markets and gain market share, except for a few pockets like pharmaceuticals, for example. So by comparison with other regions, South Asia is very closed. By comparison with its own history, it is extraordinarily open. And with this, I hand over to perhaps Zoe first and then Jonah.
I'll take the smaller country question. Indeed, I guess the audience or Koichi also saw whenever we do analysis, we tend to put Maldives and Bhutan in a different bucket comparing to other smaller ENDE countries. Those two countries are quite unique in the region in the sense that Maldives is very much reliant on tourism and I guess also fishery. Bhutan is quite landlocked, very much reliant on export of hydropower, especially to India. So by and large, both countries are very much not diversified. And we think that for faster growth, both countries do need to diversify their economy. It's also what both countries are trying to do at the time. For example, in Bhutan, through the Gelefu project, the challenge-wise, both countries are facing resilience challenge. For Maldives, it's coming both from climate and also from macro fiscal. On the climate side, I guess Maldives is one of the possibly most climate vulnerable country in South Asia, mostly because of its very low-lying island coastal areas. That's very much prone to being flooded, which would also threaten the lifeline of the country, that is tourism. And it's also very vulnerable to macro fiscal shock. As we already saw, the country had very high debt to GDP level, had difficulty repaying foreign debt, and then its foreign reserve level also dwindled. So Maldives has that aspect of resilience and or lack of resilience. And Bhutan's challenge is mostly lack of diversification and very much reliant on other South Asian countries, mainly India. And the second part of the question, does regional integration help them? Very much so in the case of Bhutan, especially through I think the World Bank also has these projects that try to link up Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and also Nepal as a bloc within the South Asia region to try to take advantage of each other's comparative advantage. I think Bhutan is or will be benefiting from that. I'm a bit doubtful how much Maldives will benefit from regional integration, mostly because Maldives income, a lot of it is relying on non-South Asia sources from tourism. Of course, Maldives also receive a lot of Indian tourists, but that also tends to depend on time and political reasons. To the question about potential jobless growth, I think that's the first part of the question. The second part goes to Jonah on female labor force participation. That question on the impact of potential jobless growth for South Asia. In the last edition of our report, also a recent working paper with Francisca and also Richard Rogerson, we looked at the question of jobless development, not exactly growth, but development in South Asia, also in other EMD countries. And we documented the I guess relevance and also prevalence of jobless development. The bottom line is that compared to other EMD countries, South Asia countries' growth have been quite jobless in the sense that the region's fast growth has not generated as much job per working age population compared to other EMD countries. I guess another interesting thing is that it's also that jobs are not critical to countries' growth or has not been, as opposed to productivity growth. But jobs are important for development. That's why we call it jobless development instead of jobless growth. Jobs are important for social security, for household security, for women's safety, self-esteem, and all those social aspects. So I'll turn over to Jonah for the many women-related questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me continue that conversation about jobless growth or development, right? And I think it is a common belief that at least part of this is the low female labor force participation rate is a demand side issue. I think where we come down in the chapter is that certainly plays a role. I think the work by Zoe and Francisco of the last report does show that South Asia is not creating enough jobs to keep up with growth in the working age population. But this certainly, to me at least, isn't can't be the whole story, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we also found in that last report was that a lot of this kind of stagnation or decline in employment ratios is driven by women, and employment shares among women, female employment shares in sectors where there should be a lot of women, as I mentioned earlier, are still incredibly low relative to other emerging markets. So, if for example, we were to see substantial job growth holding fixed the current gender composition of these services sectors, for example, then that job growth would mostly just absorb more men, and the effect on female labor force participation would actually be relatively small. So while I think creating good jobs in the non-agricultural sector is kind of a necessary condition for female labor force participation, it's I think we argued not sufficient. Now, the question on digital technology, I think, is a really interesting one, and something that we do tackle in the report. There are certain kind of very clear ways in which digital technologies can kind of help solve this problem. What the research shows is that women may lack the social networks, they may have kind of safety issues, things that make it hard to search for a job, right? There are big frictions in developing country labor markets, and those frictions are quite plausibly larger for women. We have a whole section in the chapter, in fact, where we discuss labor market frictions. Now, whenever there's frictions in a market, the role of I think digital technology can be quite clear, right? Job matching platforms, for example, can reduce search costs and reduce the reliance on social networks, which kind of may shut women out of the market. We have some work that we've been doing at SARCE on the role of digital technology with domestic workers, mostly women in Bangladesh. And these technologies can also provide more transparency to labor markets. They can provide more information. They can reduce employer market power so that they can actually improve working conditions for some of kind of the most marginalized women working in kind of informal employment. So I think the summary is that yes, they can play an important role. Now, the caveat, of course, is we need digital access, and that's far from universal in South Asia. Even in a relatively kind of connected country like India, there's still a lot of people who don't have access to smartphones, for example, and so that's a solution for a subsection of the population. It's not necessarily a solution for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the responding to the question that we received. It's 9 a.m. in Tokyo time, so I would like to ask Franziska to make the very final remark on behalf of the team, and we close the seminar. Franziska, please.
Very much. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for your interest in the topics. We will have follow-on topics, and I hope to see you in April again. Maybe with more on jobs, or maybe with some other topics, maybe more on trade, maybe more on fiscal issues. But we hope to be back, and we hope that we can again give you the same message. This is the fastest growing emerging market and developing economy region. So let's hope nothing goes wrong by April.
Great, thank you very much. This morning we had a pleasure of having Franziska Odenolge, Chief Economist, Zoe Leyushe, Senior Economist, and Jonah Lexan, Economist, all of them from the Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia region, presenting the latest edition of the South Asia Development Update titled Women, Jobs, and Growth. And we certainly are going back to you, the team, to ask you to present another edition in 6 months to give us more interesting stories about the South Asia. With that, I'd like to thank you once again, and then please stay tuned. We continue organizing the interesting online seminars. So please check our website for the latest information. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.